Welcome to the NMI podcast, and we're speaking with Dr. Michelle Barrow. And this is going to be fun because Michelle is an expert in personalized nutrition and lifestyle medicine. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a bit of background into Michelle's academic achievements, career, and accolades. She is the academic team director and clinical director at CNELM. So, for those of you not familiar with CNELM, that stands for the Center for Nutrition, Education and Lifestyle Management. It's an academic institute based here in the United Kingdom with a global reach, I'll add. Her roles include the Bachelor of Science, the Honours Nutrition Science Programme Leader, Institution Link Tutor, Lecturer, and Research Supervisor. She enjoys supporting students and achieving their aspirations. And as you'll see, she's done a lot of great collaborative work with students, encouraging them to get published and really push forward this field of personalized nutrition and lifestyle medicine. She works on developing the evidence base to support personalized nutrition practice through her academic work, through research supervision, post-doctoral research, and publication. She completed a doctorate in professional studies in 2019, which was titled Leading Transformation in Personalized Nutrition Practice. And her doctoral research included the construction of clinical tools to enable the development of new case-by-case evidence base for personalized nutrition practice in obesity management. She continues this work on the development of robust translational bioinformatics tools using pathophysiological reasoning, which is something we're going to speak about through the lens of systems biology approaches, because they're key to achieving the evidence base for personalized nutrition practice. She's published in numerous scientific journals, including autoimmunity reviews, nutrition reviews, one of my favorite, I'll add, the current research in food and nutrition. She's a registered nutritional therapist and was awarded fellow membership of the British Association of Nutrition and Lifestyle Medicine, that's BANT, in 2017 for outstanding contribution to the profession. So you've got a flavor for what Michelle's all about. And please, welcome, Michelle. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
No, it's this will be fun. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I thought a great place to start would be, how did you get into this? Like, what led you into the field of personalized nutrition and lifestyle medicine?
Sure. My own health, no. So I was quite unwell around the age of 24, and I was told I had rheumatoid arthritis and I just couldn't bear it. I was in a lot of pain, and I started to try different things. I started some acupuncture, and I was reading around nutrition, and I was doing osteopathy, and I was just kind of basically trying anything I could to feel better. And my parents were worried about me. They paid for a private rheumatologist, and I went to the appointment and I asked, will what I eat make a difference to how I feel? And they just said no. They didn't even ask me what I was eating. I could have been eating 3 McDonald's a day. It wasn't even on their radar. And I'd done enough of my own research to realize that actually I could probably have an impact. I was so infuriated by this consultation and I had been going to the doctors and saying that I'd felt the medications were making my stomach painful and making me feel worse. And through my stubbornness and anger, I stopped taking the medications. I went on a hugely restrictive diet, and I was basically on brown rice and vegetables. But within 2 weeks, I was out of bed. Within a month, I was back at work. Wow. And within 6 months, I was feeling loads better. I mean, it was just life-changing. The whole thing was life-changing. So, at that time, I wanted to go and stand outside the front doors of hospitals and go, you can make a difference. And, it turned out that I had a number of different things that were contributing to this autoimmune onslaught, which I didn't realize that I had. I had Helicobacter pylori infection. I had dairy intolerance. I'd had a fall down the stairs and my body was under a lot of stress. So there was just this plethora of things that had contributed to the expression of the rheumatoid arthritis. And by minimizing those impacts individually and working across kind of multiple levels, I managed to get myself better. Obviously, my GP told me I was in remission, but I've never had a problem since. So obviously my diet is, incorporating lots of different stuff now. It's not as strict as it was, and I feel loads better. And it is still, that experience is still the driving force behind why I did my degree, did my MSc, did my PhD, want to publish research in this work, because I know from a deeply personal level that what you eat can make a huge difference to how you feel.
It's incredible. That's a really powerful story, and thanks for sharing that. Like, what a driving force. And I think that certainly speaks to the high level of work that you're doing to push this field forward. And related to that, can you share with listeners, the kind of work that you're doing at CNELM and what the college is about?
Yeah, sure. So CNELM started in the early 2000s with a nutrition therapy degree, which is, the one that I did. They went on to develop a master's degree in personalized nutrition, and they developed a nutrition science undergraduate degree, and they've since developed a practice diploma, which is really a personalised nutrition practice diploma. It used to be called the nutrition therapy practice diploma, but very much the influence, which has stemmed a lot from the principal and research director, James Neal, was about taking this functional medicine approach and taking a very evidence-based approach. And of course, the functional medicine approach is based on pathophysiological reasoning. So we looked a lot around that time when we were developing the MSc about what personalised nutrition means. And at the time, CNELM were looking for a head of education. And I put myself forward, and they said, well, we kind of want somebody with a PhD. And I said, you pay for it, I'll do it. So, they funded my doctorate to look at, personalised nutrition and what that means and how it fits together. And it has had a huge influence. We changed the nutrition therapy practice diploma and called it the personalised nutrition practice diploma, because the underlying emphasis that we're teaching on our academic modules and on our clinical training modules is really about how you do pathophysiological reasoning, academically, the evidence behind it, and in the clinical practice, how you apply it. So, James Neal, really, the principal, again, research director, was the kind of person who invented our research methodologies that our students undertake, which are called mechanism reviews, where we're looking at the underlying evidence supporting pathophysiological mechanistic reasoning, and looking at the evidence to support evidence-based nutrition interventions whose mechanism of action ameliorate those mechanisms of pathophysiology. So, part of my research highlighted the kind of strengths and weaknesses of personalised nutrition. And then since then, we've been able to start filling some of these gaps in developing tools and developing research and all of that.
Yeah.
It's great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, hats off to James and the team. I think that gamble with you paid off.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really brought the college forward in leaps and bounds, and the work that you're contributing now is just phenomenal. I'm a huge fan. And related to that, before we get deep into what pathophysiological reasoning is and some of the work you've published there, I wouldn't mind talking about a paper that really stuck out for me. It was in Nutrition Reviews 2020, and the December issue. It's called, or the title of the paper, I should say, is Transforming Personalized Nutrition Practice. And man, that paper is like a tour de force of personalized nutrition, sort of capturing various definitions and themes within it, but also discussing some of the limitations and things that are required to advance that as a discipline. So can we unpack that paper a bit, and talk about what personalized nutrition is? Because I think your definition is very multi-dimensional, and it'd be nice to, give people a bit of color of what you're thinking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is no real definition of personalized nutrition. We start to see the term used in the literature really as a result of personalized medicine. And what personalized medicine really about is more targeting interventions, targeting drugs to genetic as a result of genetic tests. So understanding, genetic differences in individuals. And this personalized medicine approach is working really, really well, where we're targeting medicines to specific genetic subgroups, what we would call stratification. It's working really well for some conditions, such as hepatitis, for example. And we start to see that term being used. And then there was the Food for Me project. I don't know if you remember that. That came, I can't remember who the professor was that was doing it, but that was also, they were doing some interesting work there about again targeting interventions and diets to genetic, as a result of understanding individual genetics. But we all know that genetic influence on health is 10, 20%. So it's a picture, but it's not the whole picture. Personalised is also used in clinical practice to target interventions to people's social, cultural, individual preferences, right? Which for me is more about person-centered healthcare rather than personalized. So there's all these different variations of what personalized nutrition might mean. And that paper that you've highlighted was really about bringing all those things together and adding in this idea of pathophysiological reasoning, which came from functional medicine, which is this trying to overcome the limitations of current healthcare paradigms and research limitations, where interventions are targeted to diseases rather than individuals. You go to your doctor, you have some signs and symptoms, your doctor diagnoses a condition, and that then informs your intervention strategy. There are NICE guidelines and all these things that tell you what you should be doing, which is great. But we know, and as I have experienced, people come to complex diseases through their own unique routes, through their own individual biochemistry, through their own, genetic influences, diet, lifestyle, environment. So, so a disease-centered approach is kind of criticized, right? So how do we overcome that? And what the functional medicine model does is it takes signs and symptoms and uses a functional matrix where practitioners put signs and symptoms under different functional or mechanistic or physiological, those terms can be used interchangeably, headings. And then where there are clusters of signs and symptoms, you assume pathophysiology. So if there is, for example, lots of signs and symptoms under immune function and inflammation, then you would target it through an intervention which is anti-inflammatory. And by this way, you can identify more specifically which mechanisms of pathophysiology are a priority for an individual, and thereby target interventions to meet that person's physiological need rather than target the disease. People come with multiple conditions and multiple issues and multiple overlapping symptoms. And that really came from functional medicine. And that's what that paper was about. It was like, well, one, what are the limitations around what we understand about personalized nutrition? Two, what does it really mean? And then three is, how do we achieve that? How do we support pathophysiological reasoning? And Sackett's book on the philosophy of evidence-based medicine does a lot of work around that. And really, my doctorate, my research was based around developing questionnaires and clinical tools where you would ask questions around the different pathophysiological health, physiological headings, and thereby support pathophysiological reasoning in clinical practice. But it's very difficult to do, Ben. It's very difficult to do. But if we had standardized, robust clinical tools, which we are working on, and we all practitioners, nutrition practitioners, use them, and they were online, for example. And we also recorded the interventions that those individuals complied with, and we recorded the outcomes of those interventions. Then maybe we would start to develop a case-by-case evidence base. That doesn't exist currently in healthcare. We see case-by-case evidence in law, but not in healthcare. And when we've got a data set of standardized, validated clinical tools that is big enough, we should be able to use statistical machine learning to start making probabilistic predictions on the outcomes of interventions. As in, other people that ticked these boxes and had these health issues did really well on these interventions because we've got the data to do that. But that was the vision, right, when I was doing my doctorate. But the reality is it's very, very difficult to do, and you need a lot of money to do it. So, and we see that the personalised nutrition, what they call Zoe nutrition, has tried to do some of that, right? But they didn't use pathophysiological reasoning. They used again, a disease-orientated kind of approach. So not quite there, not quite there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, firstly, I'll just say that, that picture of personalized nutrition is brilliant. Like the way you've, sort of given us an overview of what it broadly means, but also compartmentalize some of those things that we normally or might associate with personalized nutrition. I have never really thought of thinking of like social factors as being, not necessarily personalized nutrition, a bit more to the side almost. And, I think that paper is starting to really hone in on what personalized nutrition is, that it incorporates multiple elements and, some sit sort of around the periphery, but at the core of it is this personalized pathophysiological reasoning as a driving force. And, as you point out, we've got functional medicine as a model for applying that in clinical practice, but there are weaknesses to that, and there's a long way to go to really develop that and validate it as a model, which it feels like a big part of your work is focused on, is pushing it forward, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, James and God bless Catherine Broom did a lot of work on that, because when I was doing my doctorate and I was kind of going into the office and going, this doesn't work for me, because I was trying to create these tools that supported pathophysiological reasoning, but there was lots of criticism, or we had some issues with the functional medicine model around semantics, mostly because one of the key aims and objectives, vision and mission of CNELM is to support the integration of personalized nutrition in mainstream healthcare. And the issue with the functional matrix was using a lot of language that isn't recognized by mainstream healthcare. So, I was kind of going into James and Catherine and saying, oh, I'm struggling. What do I do? And I said, I think I should just take like a A-level physiology textbook and just use the headings, and we can cluster signs and symptoms under those, because that for me would be easier, because there's so much overlap. And where do you put them, and the signs and symptoms, and how do we make it clearer? And that really sparked off the development of a clinical reasoning tool that we have at CNELM that Catherine and James developed while I was going back into the office every day and going, well, no, it also needs to have this, and we also need to include that. And we use that now in our clinical teachings and on our academic models. And I'm hoping students will go and use it in clinical practice, but we're forcing it. We're forcing our students to do this type of thinking, which is, where do these signs and symptoms fit under this kind of plethora of potential mechanisms? And that really came out of some of the early learnings from CNELM, myself as a student, which was, and then module leader, which was, questions like, are there hundreds of different diseases, or are there a few functional imbalances that express themselves in 100 different ways? And these sorts of ideas were very early planted into my brain at CNELM through my learnings and through functional medicine understanding, etc., and then just trying to expand that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think some listeners, not, the term pathophysiological reasoning, although they may be doing it in practice already, it might be new to them, and some it may be, a novel idea altogether if they're coming from a more conventional sort of, symptoms, diagnosis, one drug, one target kind of approach. So just winding it back a little bit, can you explain how pathophysiological reasoning is currently working in clinical practice, like through CNELM or through functional medicine or nutritional therapy? Like what are practitioners currently doing and how does that work?
Sure. Well, one thing I think that differentiates personalized nutrition practice and maybe evidence-based medicine is plurality of evidence is what we want in personalized nutrition. We want not just a hierarchy of evidence that we see in evidence-based medicine, but plurality, pulling together lots of different research and trying to understand what are the drivers of disease, not just what we see in clinical trials, which is which interventions work. We want to understand, well, why and how and what are the mechanisms, underlying that. So, how it looks in clinical practice is, again, we've developed these questionnaires that, take a health history, take a background of diet, lifestyle, environment, family history, and then exactly that. You've got these headings, either the functional matrix or our clinical reasoning tool or just your A-level physiology textbook, and you're literally, practically writing down where the symptoms sit in terms of functions, in terms of mechanisms within the body. Now, more work needs to be done on that. There are absolutely limitations of that, because something like oxidative stress, what are the signs and symptoms of oxidative stress, So we do need to develop this approach further, but it gives enough of an idea of which mechanisms, which functions within the body might need more support. And then we take the evidence-based approach. Then we look at clinical trials and intervention studies. Then we look at systematic reviews and we determine which intervention, where their mechanism of action is supporting intervention decisions to target those mechanisms of pathophysiology. The mechanistic reasoning alone isn't sufficient to make clinical decisions. The mechanistic reasoning is weak because because evidence-based medicine has pushed down this kind of plurality of evidence idea and just promoted, clinical trials and systematic reviews. So there is, a lot of work to be done in understanding pathophysiological mechanisms, and the evidence is, sometimes animal and in vitro and not even human. So you can't rely on mechanistic reasoning alone. But what it does is it helps you understand your clinical reasoning, your basically deductive, theory of what's going on for your client, and then you can think about actually what is the clinical evidence to support these ideas, and that then creates evidence-based personalized nutrition, which is using evidence-based practice as well as pathophysiological reasoning together. So rather than just targeting interventions to disease, you can be more nuanced, and you can corroborate your clinical reasoning ideas through tests, if you want to. And not that many functional tests exist currently, and that also needs further developing. But it seems to be working, right? We're getting practitioners who are being very successful in their clinical practice, and it's robust approach. And the limitations of using clinical guidelines, such as NICE guidelines, in terms of making intervention decisions, also has problems. So I'm not saying either way is better. I'm just saying it's a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really big ideas in that. And I think the overarching one that stands out for me is what we're really talking about here is changing our approach to medicine from, a symptoms equals diagnosis equals single intervention approach to something that's far more nuanced and personalized and uses a completely different way of critically thinking about the patient in front of you, basically. And I think related to all of that, another salient point that you make is that the whole system needs a shakeup, like, the way medicine's taught, but also the way research is done. I think something also that really stood out is you mentioned the hierarchy of evidence, this gold standard of randomized controlled trials and then meta-analysis maybe on top of that. But this ignores personalization and it.
Absolutely. And also, these research methodologies are built on a pharmaceutical model, right? They're looking at one intervention and one mechanism of action in one small area. And humans are complex, multivariable systems, and food and nutrition are complex, multivariable systems. So to apply that thinking in something that as complex as nutrition and human beings is very, very difficult, because how do you ever account for confounding factors? How do you account? You know what it's like to do diet research. It's massively complicated and limited. So we have to think about how we do better research that supports this thinking ultimately, that helps us understand multiple influences on health and disease. And that's why, and really it's only the developments in computer statistical machine learning and all this that's really going to allow us to do this complexity of research. We are at the cusp of another revolution, and harnessing, being able to understand that complexity through the developments in computer science. We're there now, right? We couldn't do it before, but we should be able to do that now.
Yeah, you're right. It's happening. I totally agree. I've been to a number of conferences over the last few months that have focused on the technology and how that's transforming medicine. And I wouldn't have said that last year, but things are moving so fast that something big is going to shift, I think, and
Yeah.
technology is going to drive it. One thing I wouldn't mind focusing on just briefly is the role of like testing and biomarkers and so on. And I think a reason to talk about that is a fewfold. One of them is that you raise the point that, there are limitations in that. And, a lot of listeners will be using testing. So it'd be interesting to unpack that a little bit. And I think another point is that often when people think of personalized nutrition, they go, oh, genetic testing. And the thing I loved about your paper is that it's much bigger than that. And, both in terms of tools, but also concept. So, where are we at currently with biomarkers, whether it's genetics or other, phenotypic assessments? What have we got at our disposal and what do we need in the future?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of genetic tests, and the science for those, genetic tests, are robust. The application of nutrition interventions as a result of those genetic tests is, for me, a little bit shaky and not enough evidence for that. So that certainly needs to be developed if we're really thinking about, doing genetic tests to inform intervention strategies. But for me, that's not the sexy bit, right? That's just part of the picture. For me, really developing functional tests that are going to allow us to corroborate pathophysiological reasoning is what's exciting for me. In order for us to validate this clinical approach and take, for example, the functional matrix or the our own clinical reasoning tool forward is to do some tests and say, hey, these people ticked these symptoms and these all cluster under inflammation. Let's do a inflammatory marker test and see if we can corroborate these signs and symptoms under these different headings. And we can do that for inflammation, but we can't do it for many of the other functional or physiological or mechanistic headings. So in order for us to really be able to robustly develop these tools, we need to be able to corroborate through functional tests. And, if we can develop those tests, they would support clinical practitioners as well, because clinical practitioners would have signs and symptoms and they'd be saying, hey, I think, oxidative stress might be a problem for you, and I have a test. There seems to be a little bit of a mismatch at the minute between what tests are available and what tests we really need. I don't know if you've done much functional testing, but there's lots of markers that are currently a little bit meaningless, right? And yeah, they're available, but what do they mean?
Yeah.
And we need to work more with lab tests closely to really see where they fit. And part of the research that we're doing, the students that are doing mechanism reviews where they're looking at the evidence for a particular condition or particular pathway or mechanistic reasoning is, are there any biomarkers that sit there that would highlight whether this mechanism is what's going on for somebody in real life? Because if you've got mechanism reviews and they're around, for example, osteoporosis, and two are looking at different types of underlying pathophysiology for that condition, how do we practically differentiate that in clinical practice? Can we do it through symptoms? Probably not. Can we do it through functional assessment? Probably not. So more work needs to be done. And really it's the tests that are going to give us that objective data that we need, rather than just, signs and symptoms and hoping for the best.
I get that. They're really great points. And it strikes me that currently in terms of that mismatch that you point to between what we're trying to achieve and what we've got available is that largely, I would argue, the way functional testing is working currently is that it's almost a bit of a shotgun approach. So you have a clue that a particular panel or test or biomarker might be relevant, but you don't really know. So you're just trying to see what comes up, basically. And then the big question is like, what is the hierarchy of what test would be most appropriate for the patient, which is difficult to work out when you're looking at systems biology. And also, as you point out, is that there are lots of biomarkers available as technology improves and, sampling becomes cheaper. And, we've seen this with the microbiome now. You can test 1 million data points if you want to, but what does it all mean? Is it clinically useful? Is another question. So, it feels like you've identified a gap that needs closing to me.
Yeah, I've been talking to students about this for a while, but I have a million research ideas, right, about how we can keep going with all this stuff. It's just sometimes I just need to hook a couple of students in to do it. If there's any lab companies listening that are interested in developing these things, then please do get in touch, because we have the students willing to do some research, and we have ideas of which biomarkers to develop, and there could be some great work done there.
That's a good shout. I'm sure they're listening, so that could be interesting. We'll reconvene in a few years and see what has happened.
Yes, please.
And let's speak about this work that you're doing with students and in general to push out publications based on pathophysiological reasoning. Like, there's a long list of them. I'm going to signpost some of the audience. I'll drop some of the references in the in text for people. But there's a recent one you did on pathological mechanisms of gut dysbiosis and food allergy related to probiotics. Some on herbs like curcumin, ashwagandha, saffron, but all of these looking at different mechanisms within different diseases. So, can you talk to us a bit about what the aim of this work generally is, and then maybe we can jump into one as an example and unpick it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Well, the aim is really to support pathophysiological reasoning and clinical decision making. So the methodology, which was developed by, our principal and research director, James Neal, is really a three-tranche search strategy. We understood early on that getting students to do work with surveys and external people is always difficult, right, in terms of you're relying on other people for data. The beauty about this is we're taking this evidence base of disease-orientated research that already exists and pulling it together with a systematic review strategy to look at it from a different angle. Or, there's already lots of published research, so let's pull it together and see what it says. So it's a three search tranche strategy. The first search is really about understanding a condition and the underlying pathophysiological mechanisms of that condition. And at the end of that first tranche, the student has to focus in on an area. So they're looking at review studies and they're doing some sort of thematic analysis about what are the key mechanisms that are underpinning this condition. And then as a result of that thematic analysis, they make a decision about where to focus in on. And they use the terms used in those review studies in that first search tranche as search terms for tranche two to eliminate some of the researcher bias that might otherwise underpin that search. And the tranche two is looking at human, animal, in vitro, in vivo studies that have done work around understanding the pathophysiological mechanism that the student has decided to focus on. So in essence, that tranche two is really saying, what is the weight of the evidence to do this pathophysiological mechanism of this? How does this mechanism work in health? How does it work in pathophysiology? And how robust is that evidence? Does this mechanism exist in vitro, in vivo? Does it exist in animals? Does it exist in humans? And what are the different papers saying about these mechanisms and which ones are a priority? And what are the biomarkers? And out of that tranche two, we're kind of hoping if there isn't any human research, that actually this review, this with a systematic search strategy might encourage other researchers to go and do that, human research on the mechanism. Then there's a tranche three, which is taking those pathophysiological mechanisms and thinking about, well, what interventions, what mechanism of action of interventions are there that ameliorate these mechanisms of pathophysiology, and what is the weight of that evidence? Clinical trials, systematic reviews, how strong is it, and does it work on these mechanisms, and how can we identify it in clinical practice? So that's really the approach. It's working well because students can, utilize the research that's already available. When we were first trying to publish some of these, there was a little bit of misunderstanding of some of the journals and the reviewers about what a mechanism review is. So we really boiled it down to, this is a narrative analysis with a systematic search strategy. So in essence, it's a review paper with a methodology that utilizes thematic analysis, a qualitative research methodology. But we've overcome that problem now. We don't get the feedback from reviewers now as much as we did when we first started publishing 4 years ago about, what sort of paper is this?
Yeah.
We just don't see it anymore, which is great, right? So these mechanism reviews are being accepted by all these journals and they get what it's about.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I think that's a big challenge when you've got a novel and different way of approaching things, is to have, people in traditional academia sort of get their head around it and understand what you're trying to achieve, because it's not a clinical trial, or it's
exactly
a really different way of thinking, especially. And I've seen this come up with different researchers working in like lifestyle medicine, personalized nutrition, systems biology, because it's different, to conventional, drug interventions and so on. So yeah, that's amazing. And using one as example, I think it'd be fun to talk about what this kind of approach has taught you, about this way of thinking and how it could potentially translate to clinical practice. And I wanted to highlight like one of the recent studies. It was clinical nutrition ESPN, which is pathophysiological mechanisms of gut dysbiosis and food allergy, as an investigation of probiotics as an intervention for atopic disease. And I'll admit that I haven't, gone through the paper with a fine tooth comb, but the gist of it I saw is that while the pathophysiological mechanism stands up really well, the interventions lack a bit of evidence for efficacy, although the rationale is there. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then more generally how this work is informing clinical practice?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right. And some of that is sometimes it's the constraint of the search strategies in these methodologies, right? So what we're telling students is, you have to have a condition, you have to have a mechanism within that condition. And then when you're looking at the intervention studies, you have to stick with that condition. And, you can't then go and find, papers on another condition that have beautifully and saliently talked about this intervention and how it works on this mechanism of pathophysiology. You can't include that. And I feel sorry for the students sometimes, because they get to the third tranche and they're like, but there are no studies in my condition. And you should have looked at that a bit earlier. Should have maybe planned that bit when you made a decision at tranche 2. And and it's fine. And I say to them, you know what? A no finding is just as important, because now what you're doing is you're setting up this idea of, actually, if we look at this other condition, this intervention does work for this mechanism of pathophysiology, but this work hasn't been done in this condition. And why not? And we need to substantiate this work in this condition. So it's okay. It's okay to, find limitations and dead ends, and we see them such a lot because, as you say, this is a new research approach, right? We're finding lots of gaps in the literature, we're finding lots of dead ends and requirements for further research, because it's a new way of looking at things. So it's all right, but it isn't a perfect clinical approach, because mostly when we are doing pathophysiological reasoning in clinical practice, we're not always thinking about disease. We're thinking about just the mechanism of action of intervention and the mechanism of pathophysiology. But because we have to constrain the mechanism reviews into a kind of condition, because you can't let them look at all diseases, because you'd never be able to do the research, right? You could never narrow it down. You could never do it systematically. You'd just be overwhelmed with a plethora of research unless you focused in on a specific condition. So that's currently the difference. But in the discussion areas, once you get past the results in the discussion, it's like, well, it's a shame there isn't more evidence for this, but these things need to be developed. And mostly, I think that's great, because mostly, it still informs clinical practice, because you can say, because the beauty that we have in nutrition practice is risk-benefit ratio, right? The evidence isn't really there for this, but it does look like it's there for another condition. Let's try it. Let's see what the effects are, and put in some safety measures for monitoring and risk-benefit ratio assessment, and see where we are. But yeah, it's still informing clinical practice, but clinical practice is still slightly different because it's wider. And that's one of the limitations of my own doctoral research. When I was trying to develop clinical tools to support pathophysiological reasoning, my research supervisors were saying, well, you need to do it on a condition. And I was like, well, no, I don't want to do it on a condition, because I want to do pathophysiological reasoning, which is not disease orientated. And they say, you can never do that because it's just too wide. And they were right. I did this Delphi method, which was supposed to look at reducing the questionnaire to smaller and smaller things. And every time I went out to my Delphi group, everybody said, "Oh, you didn't think about this," and "Oh, you should ask about that," and "Oh," and the questionnaire got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because when you're looking at conditions as a whole, there's so, when you're looking at every disease, there's so much to think about.
Yeah.
So it is problematic, right? It is difficult. So there's push and pull. There's advantages and disadvantages, but as I say, it's combining these things to be able to nuance clinical reasoning and evidence clinical decisions. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a great takeaway. And I think for, people in clinical practice that, your comments really speak to the reality of how, it needs to be navigated. It is nuanced, it's very individual. And even with, literature that might guide your thinking, there's always going to be exceptions to that. That's the nature of personalized nutrition. So,
Absolutely.
there'll never be clear-cut answers to anything, but that's the beauty of it. So that's a really great takeaway. And I think, as we come to sort of wrapping this interview up, I wanted to just get a big picture view of from you, who's deep in this, of what your vision of the future is. Like, if you could paint a picture of where personalized nutrition needs to go and what work needs to be done to get us there, have you got any, big picture thinking that we can close out with?
So much work, Ben. So much work. Plugging away with the reviews. Developing lab tests, developing the tools. Creating case by case evidence base. Do go and speak to James Neal about this. He's trying to apply this clinically in a company called Usen. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that yet, but do go and have a look at James's work on Usen. Yeah, for me, it's about, I'm, as you rightly said in the beginning, I'm really passionate about supporting the students. I'm really passionate about, publishing the research. I'm currently supervising some PhDs as well, and hoping that maybe as a result of that, CNELM can maybe one day start to attract some funding and do some of this work. That's really where I would like to take it. I think there is funding available, and I think publishing these papers now is going to start showing, what the justification for further doing this work, and
Yeah.
using James's computer science head and background, and my clinical head. I think we make a great team in really thinking about how to develop this in reality, and CNELM is very supportive of that. So I'm super grateful that they let me pursue my ambitions. But yeah, so much work to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we're all grateful too. I mean, the work you're doing is phenomenal, and what a great, start and vision for the future. It feels like CNELM and you and the team are an incubator for really pushing this forward. So long may the work continue. And, I
thank you.
want to, just thank you for your time. It was a really rich discussion that took us through this journey of the work that you've done, but more broadly for listeners, help conceptualize what personalized nutrition is, some of the challenges that we're facing, but also some of the strengths that we still, we have. And I think collectively, we're all in this together. We're pushing it forward. So, thank
Absolutely.
you for being there and doing that academically. It's hugely appreciated. And thank you for your time as well. It's been
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you. It's been great. I'm always happy to talk about this subject.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Ben.